When the first gun jammed, the room didn't breathe easier. It grew colder. Bumpy Johnson stood exactly where the bullets were meant to end him. A narrow Harlem apartment, curtains drawn tight against the morning light, 12 men arranged in a half-circle like executioners who believed the outcome was already decided. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and cheap whiskey. Every gun in that room was pointed at the same target, him. He didn't raise his hands, didn't plead, didn't curse God or bargain with fate. He simply looked at the men holding the weapons, some trembling, some hardened, all convinced they were about to make history. They had been told he was finished. What none of them understood was this: legends don't survive by chance. They survive because power recognizes power, and fear has a way of turning on itself. A finger pulled a trigger. Click. The sound was small, insignificant, but in that moment, it echoed louder than any gunshot Harlem had ever heard. Bumpy Johnson smiled. Not wide, not mocking, just enough to let the room know something had gone terribly wrong. By the time the second gun failed, the men realized they weren't standing over a victim. They were standing in the presence of something they did not fully understand. And by the time the 12th gun was lowered, Harlem's streets would whisper a story that would never die. 12 guns, one target, and Bumpy Johnson walked out alive. But to understand why those men failed, and why Bumpy Johnson survived every attempt to erase him, you have to understand who he was before the guns were ever raised. You have to understand Harlem. Long before that room filled with armed men, Harlem itself was a battlefield, not of open war, but of quiet control. By the 1930s and 1940s, the neighborhood was alive with music, ambition, desperation, and pride. Jazz spilled from basement clubs, numbers runners moved like shadows, police cruisers rolled slow, heavy with authority. They enforced unevenly. And in the middle of it all stood Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to the streets, the police, and the politicians by one name: Bumpy. He was not the loudest man in Harlem, not the flashiest. He didn't need to be. His presence carried weight because it was earned, inch by inch, confrontation by confrontation. Where others used chaos, Bumpy used precision. Where others relied on brute force, he relied on memory. He never forgot a favor, never forgot a slight, and he never forgave betrayal. Bumpy Johnson understood something most men didn't. Power wasn't about how many guns you carried. It was about how many people stood still when you entered a room. In Harlem, people stood still. He ran numbers operations that fed families and paid rent when the city wouldn't. He enforced rules where the law refused to protect black neighborhoods unless it came with a baton. To some, he was a criminal. To others, he was a necessary force. A man who filled the vacuum left by a system that had long abandoned them. The police knew his name, the mob knew his reputation, and the politicians, the smart ones, knew better than to speak it too loudly. Because Bumpy Johnson wasn't reckless. He was deliberate, and deliberate men don't die easily. The social climate of Harlem at the time was combustible. Italian mob families saw opportunity in black neighborhoods, but rarely offered respect. Law enforcement treated Harlem as occupied territory. Survival required negotiation with forces that didn't see the community as human, only profitable or controllable. Bumpy navigated all of it with a quiet, unsettling confidence. He spoke softly, chose his words carefully, and listened longer than most men thought wise. That made people underestimate him. right up until the moment they realized he already knew everything they were about to say. It was that reputation, calculated, calm, unyielding, that made him dangerous. And it was that same reputation that made him a target. Because power always attracts challenges. The plot to end Bumpy Johnson did not come from one man. It never does. It came from whispers, rival operators who resented his control, mob intermediaries tired of negotiating with a black man who wouldn't bow, and enforcers eager to prove themselves by taking down a legend. They didn't plan a public hit. That would invite chaos. They planned something cleaner, quieter, final. 12 guns, 12 assurances, no witnesses, one outcome. Or so they thought. What they failed to account for was that Bumpy Johnson had survived worse than bullets. He had survived betrayal, prison, police pressure, and the slow grind of institutional hatred. He had learned patience behind bars, learned psychology in silence, learned that fear, when exposed, can paralyze even the most armed man in the room. The men who lured him into that apartment believed they were bringing him to his end. In reality, they were stepping into a test, one that would decide who truly controlled Harlem's balance of power. And when the first trigger failed, the test had already begun. The silence after the first failed trigger pull didn't break. It thickened. Bumpy Johnson didn't move. He didn't rush for cover or reach for a weapon of his own. He stayed where he was, coat buttoned, hat still on his head, eyes moving slowly from face to face. 12 men, 12 guns, 12 different expressions. Confusion, irritation, doubt, and something far more dangerous than fear. Uncertainty. The man holding the jammed pistol cursed under his breath and worked the slide again. His hands shook just enough for Bumpy to notice. "Easy," Bumpy said calmly, his voice low and even. "You gone hurt yourself." The words weren't a taunt. They were a warning. That was when the second gun misfired. The sound echoed off the walls, a hollow click where thunder was supposed to be. Another man tried again. Nothing. He slapped the side of the weapon like it had betrayed him personally. Now the room shifted. Men adjusted their footing. Eyes darted. Someone swallowed hard. These weren't amateurs. They were hired hands, men who had killed before. But none of them had ever been in a room where death hesitated this long. Bumpy Johnson let the moment stretch. He understood the psychology of power. The longer a threat hesitates, the more it weakens. Guns were only as strong as the belief behind them, and belief was leaking out of that room, one jammed weapon at a time. "You fellas look nervous," Bumpy said, his tone conversational. "That ain't how this supposed to go, is it?" No one answered. They had rehearsed shouting orders. They had rehearsed the moment of violence. They had not rehearsed the legend speaking back. The truth was, this wasn't the first time Bumpy Johnson had been set up. Years earlier, rivals had tried poisoning him. He'd tasted it in the back of his throat and stopped eating halfway through the meal. Another time, police had dragged him into a precinct, confident they finally had him cornered, only to watch him walk out untouched, charges evaporated by arrangements they never saw being made. Bumpy learned early that survival wasn't luck, it was preparation. That morning, when he agreed to meet, he knew something was off. Too many intermediaries, too much insistence on privacy, too many reassurances. But refusing the meeting would have signaled weakness. And weakness in Harlem traveled faster than truth. So he came anyway. Because men who believe they control the moment make mistakes. The third gun fired, but the bullet tore into the ceiling, not into Bumpy Johnson. Plaster rained down like dust from a crumbling empire. That was the moment fear arrived fully. Someone shouted. Another man stepped back. One gun wavered, its barrel drifting away from Bumpy's chest. Bumpy raised a hand slowly. Not surrender, command. Let's talk, he said. The words cut through the chaos sharper than any shot. He wasn't asking. He was reminding them of something they had forgotten. That this wasn't just a hit. This was politics. You don't kill a man like me without consequences, Bumpy continued, and every one of you knows that. The men glanced at each other. They knew exactly what he meant. If Bumpy Johnson died in that room, Harlem wouldn't shrug. The streets would demand answers. Alliances would fracture. Retaliation would be swift, brutal, and unending. Every man in that apartment would be hunted, not just by Bumpy's people, but by others eager to prove loyalty or seize territory in the chaos. Killing a legend didn't end problems. It multiplied them. The fourth and fifth guns stayed silent. The sixth man lowered his weapon slightly, just enough to betray his doubt. Bumpy locked eyes with him. "You got a family?" Bumpy asked. The man stiffened, didn't answer. "You got somebody waiting for you to come home tonight?" Bumpy pressed. That did it. The man's jaw tightened, his grip loosened. He wasn't paid enough for this kind of legacy. One by one, the guns stopped looking like instruments of power and started looking like liabilities. The men had been hired to kill a man. They hadn't been hired to become a symbol. Outside that apartment, Harlem moved on like it always did, unaware of how close its balance had come to collapse. Street vendors set up carts, kids ran errands, numbers were played, music floated from open windows. Inside, history was being renegotiated. Bumpy Johnson took a slow step forward. No one stopped him. "That's close enough," someone finally said, voice cracking. Bumpy stopped anyway, because he had already made his point. "This was a mistake," he said plainly. "And mistakes can be fixed." The men listened. "Put the guns down. Walk away. Tell whoever sent you that I'm still here. And if they got something to say, they can say it to me directly." He paused, letting the weight of his next word settle. Because sending boys to do a man's work, that's disrespect. The room absorbed the insult, not with anger, but with recognition. Whoever ordered this had underestimated him. And everyone in that room knew who paid for underestimation in Harlem. The seventh gun hit the floor, then the eighth. By the time the ninth was lowered, the outcome was sealed. But legends aren't forged just by survival. They're forged by what comes next. As the men backed toward the door, Bumpy Johnson adjusted his coat and straightened his hat. He didn't rush them. He didn't threaten them. He let them leave with the story. Because stories travel farther than bullets. And by nightfall, every corner of Harlem would know the same truth. 12 guns had been raised against Bumpy Johnson, and not one had the courage to finish the job. What no one yet understood was that the real confrontation wasn't over. The men with the guns were only the surface. The real challenge was still waiting, watching, calculating, deciding whether to retreat or escalate. By the time the sun dipped behind the brownstones, Harlem already knew. Not the details, not yet. But the feeling, the shift, the subtle tightening in the air that only comes when power changes hands without a single body hitting the pavement. Men leaned closer in barbershops, Numbers runners slowed their steps. Club owners lowered their voices when his name came up. Bumpy Johnson had walked out again. And the people who mattered understood exactly what that meant. But somewhere beyond Harlem, in rooms with cleaner carpets and colder intentions, survival was being mistaken for defiance. The men who ordered the hit didn't see themselves as reckless. They saw themselves as practical. They were operators who believed Harlem had grown too comfortable under one man's control. Bumpy was useful, yes. Predictable, disciplined. But usefulness has an expiration date when it begins to look like authority. And authority, in their world, was not meant to be shared. They sat around a long table that night, smoke curling toward a ceiling that had never heard jazz. No shouting, no panic, just irritation. 12 guns, one of them said quietly, and he's still breathing. Another man leaned back, fingers steepled. That wasn't luck. No, the first replied. That was a warning. They all understood the implication. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a man who ran Harlem's numbers. He was a stabilizing force. And removing him without a replacement had consequences they weren't ready to manage. But letting him live untouched, that sent a different message, one they couldn't afford. Back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson didn't celebrate. He sat in a back room, alone, nursing a drink he barely touched. Survival sharpened his focus. It didn't soothe it. He replayed the scene carefully, not with relief, but with calculation. Who knew the meeting location? Who vouched for it? Who stood to gain from chaos? Bumpy knew better than to assume victory. When men fail publicly, they often strike privately. When power is challenged and not reclaimed, it festers. And festering power always looks for blood. He sent word quietly. Not orders, questions. Names were spoken, timelines reconstructed, patterns examined. Harlem had eyes everywhere, and Bumpy had earned their loyalty not through fear, but through consistency. People talked, and what they said confirmed his instincts. This wasn't just a move against him, it was a test. The rising tension wasn't loud, it crept. Police cruisers lingered longer than usual. Rivals grew bold in places they had previously avoided. Small violations were suddenly allowed to stand. A corner taken here, a collector pushed there. The message was subtle but clear. Your grip is slipping. Bumpy watched it all, without reacting. Because reacting too early was exactly what his enemies wanted. The real challenge arrived 3 nights later, wrapped in formality. A messenger, clean suit, clean shoes, careful words, requested a meeting. Neutral ground, no weapons, no theatrics, just a conversation between reasonable men. Bumpy smiled when he heard that. Reasonable men didn't send 12 guns. But he agreed. Because legends don't hide from the second knock. The meeting took place in a quiet club after hours. Tables empty, lights dimmed low. The kind of place where history preferred to stay unnoticed. Bumpy arrived first, sat alone, hands folded. Unarmed, visibly so. That was intentional. The others entered together. Confident, measured, trying not to betray the tension beneath their composure. These weren't street enforcers. These were planners, strategists, men who believed themselves above consequence. They exchanged pleasantries that meant nothing. Then one of them leaned forward. "You had a scare," the man said, voice smooth. "Unfortunate misunderstandings happen." Bumpy didn't respond. Another continued. "But perhaps it's time to reconsider how things are structured in Harlem." There it was, the attempt to rewrite authority without acknowledging failure. Bumpy finally spoke. 12 guns, he said softly. That's a strong misunderstanding. The room stilled. You send boys, Bumpy continued. Boys who didn't know what they were walking into. That's on you. The man across from him stiffened. You're still alive. That should count for something. Bumpy's eyes hardened, not with anger, but clarity. It does, he replied. It counts as mercy. The confrontation didn't explode. It settled. Bumpy laid out his terms without raising his voice. Harlem would remain stable. Operations would continue uninterrupted. No new encroachments, no silent tests, no proxy violence. In return, he offered something rare in their world: predictability. You know where I stand, Bumpy said. You know how I move, and you know what happens when lines get crossed. The men exchanged glances. They weren't being threatened. They were being reminded that chaos was expensive, that legends absorbed shock better than institutions, that killing Bumpy Johnson would create a vacuum none of them wanted to fill personally. After a long silence, one of them nodded. For now, he said. Bumpy stood. For always, he corrected. When he left the club, the night felt different, not lighter, sharper. The confrontation had reached its peak, not with gunfire, but with understanding, the kind that forces men to reconsider their reach. But Harlem was watching, and what mattered most wasn't what had been said behind closed doors. It was what didn't happen afterward. No retaliation, no escalation, no blood. That silence spoke volumes. Because when powerful men choose restraint, it's not mercy they're showing. It's respect. Respect doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in what doesn't happen. The days after the meeting passed without explosions, without sudden arrests, without bodies turning up in alleyways. No corners changed hands overnight. No new faces tried to test old boundaries. Harlem stayed steady. And in that stillness, the truth settled in. Bumpy Johnson had not just survived an execution. He had survived a challenge to his authority, and he had won without firing a single shot. But the men who had moved against him weren't finished feeling the weight of that loss. Power doesn't like to be embarrassed. The failed hit had already bruised reputations. The quiet negotiation that followed confirmed something far worse, that Bumpy Johnson could not be removed cleanly. And men who build empires on clean removals do not sleep well, knowing a variable still stands in their way. So they tried something else. Not violence, pressure, police. Attention intensified. Raids came quicker. Warrants were broader. Minor charges were suddenly treated like capital offenses. The system leaned in, hoping weight alone would do what bullets could not. Bumpy saw it immediately, and he adjusted. He began moving differently, not hiding, but appearing. He showed up at clubs early, walked the streets openly, talked to shop owners, ate in public. He let himself be seen because invisibility invites suspicion. Visibility invites accountability. The police didn't like it. They followed him anyway. One afternoon, they finally made their move. Not dramatic, not loud, just a slow approach, badges out, voices calm but condescending. Mr. Johnson, the lead officer said, we need a word. Bumpy stopped walking, turned slowly, looked at the men like he had all the time in the world. Then talk, he said. They tried to bait him, asked questions they already knew the answers to, pushed insinuations without evidence. The kind of pressure meant to provoke a mistake. Bumpy gave them none. When they finally let him go, frustrated and empty-handed, the message was clear. The state had blinked too, and Harlem noticed. The real confrontation, the one that sealed everything, didn't come from guns or courts. It came from the streets. A rival crew, emboldened by rumors of Bumpy's supposed vulnerability, decided to test his reach. They moved into a corner that wasn't theirs, pressured collectors, and made sure word got back to him. It was disrespect, and in Harlem, disrespect demanded response. But Bumpy didn't send shooters. He sent presence. That night, he walked into the rival's main operation, alone. No entourage, no threats. Just him, stepping into the space like he belonged there. The room froze. The men inside were young, hungry, nervous. They had believed the whispers, believed the legend was fading. They were wrong. Bumpy looked around slowly, taking in the scene. Then he spoke. "This corner," he said, "isn't yours." One of the younger men laughed, sharp, forced. "Everything changes," he said. Bumpy nodded. "It does." Then he leaned closer. "But not today." There was no shouting, no weapon drawn, just the weight of consequence hanging in the air. The young men felt it immediately. The same feeling the 12 gunmen had felt when the triggers failed. This wasn't a man they could rush. This was a man who ended things quietly. They backed down. By morning, the corner was returned without a single punch thrown. That, more than anything else, confirmed the shift. Justice didn't come as punishment. It came as alignment. The men who had plotted against Bumpy Johnson adjusted their operations subtly. Fewer tests, clearer boundaries, quieter respect. Law enforcement redirected its attention elsewhere. Rivals chose different targets. Harlem stabilized, and stability is the clearest sign of power. The consequences of that failed hit rippled outward. Younger operators learned an important lesson. Legends aren't loud. They don't rush. They don't panic. They wait. Community leaders spoke his name with renewed assurance. Shopkeepers slept easier. Parents sent kids outside without fear of sudden chaos. Order, imperfect but dependable, held. Bumpy Johnson didn't announce victory. He simply continued. Years later, people would argue about how many times death came for him. Some would exaggerate, some would minimize. But the core of the story never changed. 12 guns had been raised. One man had stood still. And the city had recalibrated around that fact. Because true authority isn't proven by how much damage a man can do. It's proven by how much damage stops when he speaks. The legacy of that moment didn't belong only to Bumpy Johnson. It belonged to Harlem. It was a reminder that even in systems designed to erase dignity, respect could still be demanded. And sometimes enforced without chaos. Bumpy Johnson became more than a name after that. He became a boundary. Cross him, and the world didn't explode. It corrected itself. The city never put it in writing. No decree, no announcement, no formal acknowledgement of what had changed. But Harlem understood. After the guns failed and the pressure faded, after the police backed off and the rivals stepped aside, something settled into place. A quiet, unspoken agreement that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not to be tested lightly again. Justice, in this case, didn't arrive wearing a badge or carrying a weapon. It arrived as restraint. The men who had ordered the hit paid their price not in blood, but in limitation. Doors once open to them closed slowly. Opportunities narrowed. Their influence in Harlem became conditional, negotiated through intermediaries instead of assumed by force. They hadn't lost everything, but they had lost certainty. And for men like that, uncertainty was punishment enough. Bumpy didn't retaliate. That was the part no one expected. He didn't take territory, didn't humiliate anyone publicly, didn't send warnings soaked in violence. He allowed his enemies to keep their dignity, because stripping it away would have forced them to reclaim it. Instead, he let them live with the knowledge that they had failed, and that knowledge followed them everywhere. Within Harlem, the reaction was immediate and personal. Old men nodded when he passed. Young men watched more closely. Women who had known loss at the hands of chaos spoke his name with something close to gratitude. The community didn't romanticize what he was. They understood the contradictions. But they respected what he provided. Consistency. Bumpy Johnson didn't promise safety. He promised order. And in a world that offered black neighborhoods neither protection nor fairness, order was currency. One evening, weeks after the attempt on his life, Bumpy stood on a street corner watching the neighborhood breathe. Kids ran past him, laughing. A shop owner locked up without glancing over his shoulder. Music drifted from a second-floor window. Life continued. That was the victory. A younger associate approached him cautiously. "You ever think about what would have happened if one of those guns worked?" Bumpy didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was calm. "They all worked," he said. "Just not the way they planned." The justice of that moment wasn't about dominance. It was about balance restored. The police learned that pressure without proof only strengthened his standing. Rivals learned that shortcuts led to stalemates, and Harlem learned that power could be exercised without spectacle. Bumpy Johnson had forced everyone to adjust, not by breaking the rules, but by exposing how fragile they were when misused. Years later, stories would circulate. Some said the guns jammed because they were old. Others said the men lost their nerve. A few whispered about fate, luck, divine intervention. Bumpy never corrected them. Legends don't clarify. They let the truth settle into myth where it belongs. The long-term consequence was simple and profound. No one tried that again. Attempts on his life didn't stop because he was untouchable. They stopped because the cost-benefit equation had changed. Killing him promised chaos. Letting him live promised order. And order, even in the criminal world, is a powerful incentive. The justice wasn't loud. It didn't demand applause. It existed in the absence of funerals, the lack of reprisals, the quiet nights where Harlem slept without the sound of sirens chasing consequences. Bumpy Johnson returned to his routines. Meetings, negotiations, walks through the neighborhood, carrying himself the same way he always had. But everyone else carried him differently now, with distance, with caution, with respect. The moment with the 12 guns didn't make him a legend. It confirmed one. Because legends aren't born in victory. They're revealed in survival, and in what survives because of them. By the time the years put distance between Harlem and that morning, with the 12 guns, the story had stopped belonging to the men who were there. It belonged to the streets. Stories don't survive because they're accurate. They survive because they explain something people feel but can't always name. And the story of Bumpy Johnson surviving 12 guns explained power better than any lecture ever could. In Harlem, his name became shorthand. If a deal felt unfair, someone would say, "That ain't how Bumpy would have done it." If violence threatened to spiral, someone else would remind them, "You want this to turn into a bumpy situation?" He became a reference point, not just for fear, but for restraint. That was his real legacy, not intimidation, expectation. Young men who never met him still learned his methods, not from books or court records, but from the way older operators spoke about him, with precision, not exaggeration. They say he never rushed. They say he never raised his voice unless it mattered. They say when he walked into a room, everyone already knew why. And always, eventually, the same story surfaced. 12 guns, one target, no funeral. Historians would later argue about his role: criminal, community figure, power broker, contradiction. They'd debate morality, legality, impact. But none of them could erase this truth. Harlem functioned differently when Bumpy Johnson was alive. Violence had boundaries. Disrespect had consequences. And power, once earned, was exercised with discipline. That discipline had been forged over years. Prison sentences, betrayals, negotiations with men who didn't see him as equal. The moment with the 12 guns wasn't an anomaly. It was a culmination. Even law enforcement adjusted its language over time. His name appeared in reports without the dismissive tone it once carried. Officers spoke carefully. Captains chose different battles, not because he was above the law, but because the law understood leverage when it saw it. Bumpy Johnson existed in a space few men ever reach, where removing him would cost more than tolerating him. That is the quiet definition of legendary status. Toward the end of his life, when his pace slowed and others tried to step into the vacuum early, the old stories were retold more often, not as nostalgia, but as instruction. "You think you're tough?" someone would ask. Bumpy stared down 12 guns and walked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a warning. The legacy of that moment didn't live in headlines. It lived in what didn't happen afterward. No war to avenge him. No scramble to replace him. No legend shattered by exposure. Just a steady acknowledgement that some men shape their environment so completely that even their enemies adapt to them. Bumpy Johnson was one of those men. When he eventually died, not by violence, but by time, Harlem didn't erupt. It paused. And in that pause, people understood what had been lost. Not a saint, not a hero, but a stabilizing force in a world that rarely offered any. The 12 guns became symbolic. They represented every attempt to silence a man through force alone, every assumption that power comes from numbers, every belief that fear is enough. Bumpy Johnson proved otherwise. He proved that authority comes from composure, that survival can be a statement, that sometimes the strongest response is refusing to panic. His legend wasn't built on how many men he killed. It was built on how many didn't have to die. And that is why the story lasted. This wasn't just a story about 12 guns that failed. It was a story about what happens when force meets composure and loses. Bumpy Johnson didn't survive because the weapons were faulty. He survived because the men holding them lacked something far more important than ammunition: certainty. That room, surrounded by steel and intent, he understood what few ever do. That fear spreads faster than courage, and once it turns, it cannot be called back. What happened that day wasn't a miracle. It was a reckoning for every system that believed numbers alone could erase authority. For every man who thought power could be borrowed for a moment and returned without consequence. For every attempt to silence a voice without understanding why it carried weight in the first place. This was about more than Bumpy Johnson's survival. It was about Harlem's dignity. In a time when respect was denied by law and demanded by force, he proved there was another way, not gentler, not cleaner, but controlled. He showed that stability could be enforced without chaos, that restraint could command more fear than violence, and that a man who knows who he is cannot be rushed into extinction. Legends aren't built when things go right. They are revealed when everything goes wrong and the man at the center refuses to fold. 12 guns pointed at one target should have ended a story. Instead, they began one. Because long after the men with the weapons were forgotten, long after the rooms and faces faded into history, Harlem remembered the moment power blinked first. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything.